Hi, welcome to Advanced Music Theory. I'm your host, Michael Albertson, and we're going to be covering secondary dominants. If this is your first time watching, I encourage you to grab a pen and paper to take notes on, and I would like to remind you that all examples given in this tutorial will revolve around the key of C. So, without further ado, let's get started. What are secondary dominants? Secondary dominants are non-diatonic chords which help build up tension in an arrangement. They are an easy alternative to diatonic chords and add complexity to your arrangement. Here is a basic diatonic chord progression. Now, let's add our secondary dominant chords to enhance the complexity of this chord progression. Notice how in our new chord progression, we have the chords A7 flat 9 and D7. Even though they're not diatonic chords in the key of C major, they still sound good. This is a basic example of how secondary dominants can enhance your chord progression. Today, we're going to be looking at how to find a chord's secondary dominant and how to use them appropriately in an arrangement. So, how do we find a chord's secondary dominant? Well, we know that chords are just notes stacked in thirds. We have 1, 3, 5, and 7. Finding the secondary dominant within a chord is way easier than it sounds. All we need to do is find the fifth of a chord and turn that into a dominant chord. For example, the secondary dominant of F major 7 is C7 because C is the fifth note in an F major 7 chord. The secondary dominant of G7 is D7 because D is the fifth note in a G7 chord. Okay, so now we know how to find a chord's secondary dominant. It's just by taking the fifth of a chord and turning it into a dominant chord. Can we do this for every chord within a key? Well, sort of. The process is the exact same, but the outcome is a little different. Let me show you. So, if a chord has a major third, its secondary dominant will be a dominant chord. However, if a chord has a minor third, its secondary dominant will be a 7 flat 9 chord. Let's run through a few examples. We know that the secondary dominant of F major 7 is C7 because C is the fifth note of an F major 7 chord. But what about the secondary dominant for a D minor 7? Well, the fifth note of D minor 7 is A, and since D minor 7 is a minor chord, the secondary dominant will be A7 with a flat 9 on the end, giving us A7 flat 9. Let's do another chord. What about E minor 7? Well, let's look at the fifth note of an E minor 7 chord. it's B. So since E minor is a minor chord, its secondary dominant will be B7 flat 9. Great! Now we know how to find a chord's secondary dominant. It's just by taking the fifth note of a chord and turning it into a dominant. But how do we use them when arranging a piece of music? Alright, this is where things start to get a bit complicated. So let's go through this slowly. Let's look at the chords in the key of C. We know that G7 will resolve nicely to C, since it contains a tritone interval that pulls you towards C. If we look at the C major chord, we can see that the fifth note of C is G. Since G7 is a dominant chord, it's a great way of creating tension to prepare you for C major 7. So, if we wanted to prepare the listener for an F major 7 chord, we can find its secondary dominant, C7, and place it in front of F major 7. This creates harmonic tension that prepares the F major 7 chord. Let's compare these two chord progressions. One of them only has diatonic chords, and the other utilizes F major 7's secondary dominant. Notice how by putting the secondary dominant in front of its chord, we've appropriately added harmonic tension and resolved it. When adding a secondary dominant to a chord progression, we do not replace the chord with a secondary dominant, because a secondary dominant will always want to pull towards its own tonic chord. Notice how this chord progression doesn't sound great? It's because we replaced F major 7 with its secondary dominant, rather than putting it in front. Now we know what a secondary dominant is, and how to use one when arranging. So, let's take a look at a chord progression and add secondary dominants to them. Well, let's start by adding F major 7's secondary dominant. The fifth note in F major 7 is C, so let's place C7 in front of F major 7. Great! What else can we do? Well, let's add E minor 7's secondary dominant. The fifth note of E minor 7 is B, and since E minor 7 is a minor chord, its secondary dominant will be B7 flat 9. Perfect. Let's do one more. Let's add A minor 7's secondary dominant. The fifth note of A minor 7 is E, and since A minor 7 is a minor chord, its secondary dominant will be E7 flat 9. Let's listen to this chord progression again. The first time, we'll listen to it without secondary dominance, and then we'll listen to it with secondary dominance. Wow, just by adding secondary dominance, we've made this diatonic chord progression so much more complex and interesting. Congratulations! Now you know how secondary dominants work. In the next video, we're going to be talking about passing diminished chords. I'm your host, Michael Albertson, and I hope you've enjoyed.